What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. Over the past few weeks, I've been catching a bunch of fish on a jig, and so in this video, I want to give you my 3 rules of springtime jig fishing. Let's get into it. My first rule of springtime jig fishing is find the 3-way stops. What I mean by this is you want to find a place on your lake where 3 different types of cover meet in the same place. I spend a lot of time fishing on Beaver Lake and Table Rock Lake, which are both highland reservoirs. There are parts that are very deep and clear and others that are shallow and dirty, but overall you have a lot of rock, wood, and docks. When you have a lot of cover that looks the same, the key that I've found is to find where, again, 3 different types of cover meet in one spot. The most productive combination for me this spring has been where I can find a rock transition next to either a boat dock or a laydown. A rock transition is basically any place on the bank where you have bigger rock transitioning into smaller rock. This could be really big boulders transitioning into chunk rock transitioning into pea gravel, or really any other combination of rock. In addition to having that rock transition, you want to have that third piece of cover, whether that's a boat dock or a log or laydown that is right on that transition point. You'll be surprised at how few of these you actually have on a given section of your lake, and most of these stretches are going to be no more than 20 to 30 yards long. This allows you to eliminate a ton of water, so instead of fishing a mile stretch of bank, you only have to fish a 20 or 30 yard stretch, pick it apart very thoroughly with that jig, and then move to the next stretch. And that's really the biggest key with jig fishing. Because you work a jig relatively slow when you're retrieving it in, it's not a great bait for covering a ton of water. So finding a really small, specific area to target is going to improve your odds dramatically. Now, sometimes you might find that certain 3 cover combinations are better than others. For example, on some of my fishing trips, I found that the transitions from the bigger slate rock or boulder rock to the chunk rock have been better with boat docks. On other days, I found that they're more on the kind of pea gravel to chunk rock transitions with logs on them. And you have to run a bunch of these different transitions on a day to figure out what the pattern for that day is. It changes depending on the stage of the fish, the water temperature, the water clarity, the type of lake you're on, all kinds of things. And you don't always have to just find rock, docks, and wood. You can also find transitions in different types of cover depending on what you have on your lake. For example, if you have a lot of grass on your lake, maybe a transition from hydrilla to milfoil with a little bit of rock mixed in is that 3 cover combination you need to find. Now, if you're on a river system like the Arkansas River, you may find that a stretch of riprap with some water willow and then some matted grass mixed together is going to be where you have the most success. And I could go on and on about all these different combinations, but again, it's really just finding those 3 types of cover meeting in one spot. By focusing on these types of areas, you're going to eliminate 80% of your lake before you even launch your boat, which is very helpful in the spring. And then once you do start getting a few bites, you can pattern that area very effectively. Now, you may have to run all around your lake to find these combinations, and that's what I've had to do on Table Rock and Beaver recently. I can't just stay in like a 1-mile stretch of my lake. I may have to run 5, 6, 7 miles around the lake, finding these different combinations. And maybe the jig isn't always the #1 option in those scenarios, but most of the time I can at least start patterning with the jig and get some really good bites, then maybe pick up baits like a spinner bait or a crankbait or other baits to continue to add fish in the boat. But if you're fishing a jig in the springtime, I highly recommend looking for these small 20-yard stretches where 3 types of cover meet, because you're going to have a lot better success and improve your odds of getting on a jig bite in the spring. My second rule of springtime jig fishing is go big or go home. There are a lot of anglers on the lake in the spring, and a lot of anglers are going to be fishing baits like a Texas rig or even a smaller jig. And to differentiate yourself from the crowd, you a lot of times have to throw a bait that looks different from what other anglers are throwing in the exact same areas. Even if they're not specifically targeting those 3 cover intersections, they're probably going to end up fishing through them eventually. And if you are throwing the exact same bait as these anglers, you're going to be putting yourself at a disadvantage. That's why I throw kind of unique and different jigs in the springtime to give myself a little bit of an edge. The 2 jigs that I've been throwing a lot this spring are both pretty unique and different from what I feel like most people are throwing. The first jig that I've been throwing, especially when the water temps were a little bit colder and those fish were a little bit deeper, is this Jewel 11/16 ounce HD flipping jig. This is a lot heavier jig than I feel like a lot of anglers are going to be throwing, and I like to throw this heavier jig for two reasons. First, it allows me to get my bait down into the cover quicker and work it a little bit deeper than a lot of other anglers are in this time of the year. The banks I like to fish a lot in the Ozark region have these stair steps that go from 0 to 2 foot, 3 to 5 foot, and 6 to 8 foot. And by throwing this 11/16 ounce jig, I can work those different zones very efficiently because this bait will fall down into those zones quicker than a 3/8 ounce jig or a 1/2 ounce jig. I also feel like I can get bigger bites on this 11/16 ounce jig from the more aggressive fish because it falls a little bit faster and just gets in their face. And I just feel like I can get better bites, more bites, and be more efficient when those water temperatures are, let's say, in that like 55 to 58 degree range and the fish are just a little bit deeper. It also works great when the water is a little bit clearer as well because those fish are going to have less time to look at the bait and react to it as it falls past their face. I can slow the bait down by putting a little bit bulkier trailer on here, like this Yamamoto flapping hog, or I can go with a little bit more subtle trailer that doesn't maybe resist as much in the water and lets it fall faster, like this Big Bite Baits College Craw. These are kind of my two go-to trailers on my jigs. Now, once that water temperature gets above 58 degrees, I don't actually like to throw such a heavy jig, and instead I actually want to go on the opposite end of the spectrum. I want a jig that falls relatively slow, that has a big profile, that I can also cast really easily. And the jig that I've kind of landed on recently is this Picasso old school rubber Dock Rocket jig. You may have seen in one of my recent videos I caught a really nice post-spawn fish actually and some pre-spawn fish on this jig. And the thing that's special about this jig is that it has this really thick skirting material. The skirting material is different from what most guys are going to be throwing on their jig, and it's going to slow the fall rate down on this bait. It also has that bulkier profile, so those fish that are ready to get their very last meal before they spawn, or that just got done spawning and want to get a really good meal, are going to like this bigger profile jig. It also falls a little bit slower, and so in dirtier water, and when those fish are maybe just a little bit closer to that spawning time, whether it's right before they spawn or right after they spawn, this bigger jig I feel gets more bites than the smaller skirted jigs or the heavier jigs that fall super fast. Again, that 58 degree water temperature is kind of that cutoff range for me. And I'm usually pairing this jig with the same two trailers. If I'm fishing in a little bit clearer water, I'll go with this Big Bite Baits College Craw just because it's a little more subtle. But if I'm in dirtier water, I'll go to that Yamamoto flapping hog to really slow the fall rate down to this jig. So it's just gliding through those areas. And between these two jigs, this is pretty much all I need in the spring. These work when the fish are in that pre-spawn mode, and it'll work all the way up until they get into that post-spawn mood before they move out to the summer ledges. So when the water temperatures hit about like maybe 70 degrees or so, there'll still be some fish around boat docks, bushes, grass, things like that, and I can catch them really well in these jigs, again, until they pull all the way offshore. So these are the two baits I like to throw, doing something a little bit different from what other anglers are throwing, and trying to just mix it up with some heavier jigs in the colder water and some bulkier, slower falling jigs in that warmer water. And as far as my gear I'm throwing with all this, my go-to rod is basically just a 7'4" heavy power, fast action Denali worm and jig rod in the Lithium Pro lineup. I love this rod. It's super sensitive and it has held up for like 3 years. Flipping fish in the boat, and the guides and stuff are super high quality, so I can't recommend these rods enough. They're a great investment. As far as the reel, I'm just putting a Abu Garcia Max Pro. I picked this up at like Academy 3 or 4 years ago, and it's not that expensive of a reel, but it gets the job done. It's a little bit better quality than the 5-year-old Black Maxes I have that are still working pretty well, so it skips the jig a little bit better than that $30 reel, but this reel is still under $100, so I really like it. And then as far as my line goes, I'm just pairing that with some 20-pound fluorocarbon. And that's kind of my setup. If you guys actually want to pick up some of these Denali rods, there's a discount code that I have that you can go down in the description and find. If you go to denalirods.com, it's a great discount and allow you to pick up some of these really nice rods at a great price. My third rule of springtime jig fishing is fish thoroughly but fast. When I take friends out jig fishing in the spring, I think a lot of them are surprised at one, how thorough I am at fishing the areas I select, but also how fast I retrieve my bait. Because I'm really focused on those 20-yard stretches I talked about in rule number 1, I feel very confident that I'm going to be putting my bait around fish. So I want to hit every single possible angle and target in those areas, whether that is making 5, 6, 7 casts into the back corner of a dock, or making 5 or 6 pitches to one laydown log from different angles. But even though I'm making a lot of presentations to one area and not moving my boat very quickly, I'm fishing my jig pretty fast. Very rarely do I pitch my jig out, let that bait just sit there on the bottom for 5-10 seconds, move it a few feet, and let it sit there for 5 or 10 more seconds. Instead, I like to move my jig a lot faster than that, basically putting it into the area, hopping it once or twice, then basically just swimming it back to the boat. The reason I do this is because I'm trying to prioritize making as many presentations or casts as possible at different angles to put my bait in front of as many fish as I can in a given day. The slower you fish your jig, the less water you can cover, and I really only slow down when I'm jig fishing when I feel like I've developed an extremely specific pattern. For example, if I'm fishing on the Arkansas River and I figure out that the fish are setting up on a very specific cover combination, where that's like matted grass, riprap, and water willow all in one spot, and there's only 10 of those stretches and they're all 20 yards long. In that situation, I'm going to slow down a lot because I don't have that much water to cover anyways. And by slowing down, you may be able to pick off a fish that's actually setting up on a bed, or maybe irritate a fish into actually biting. So the fewer 3 cover combinations I have and the more specific my pattern, the slower I'll fish and the more methodically I'll fish, because I'm basically trying to coax the fish into biting, or get them to eat my bait, not have a reaction, but actually by just annoying them enough until they bite. But if you have a lot of water you can cover and you have a bigger lake, let's say it's 10, 15 miles of water you can fish, and there's 30 spots that kind of match your pattern. In that situation, I'd rather fish a lot faster and just put my bait in front of the active fish that are willing to bite. In addition, a lot of times I like to rerun the exact same banks over and over again and prefer to fish the same banks multiple times, waiting for those aggressive fish to move in, rather than fishing each spot for 20 or 30 minutes, then going to the next spot for 20 or 30 minutes. And even in that situation I talked about in the Arkansas River, where I just had a few key stretches, most of the time I'm going to fish each of those stretches at least 2 to 3 times in a day. And if I have 8 hours to fish, even if I spend 15 minutes fishing that 20-yard stretch 3 times, it's really not that much of a time commitment because I don't have that much water to fish anyways. So that's kind of my theory on jig fishing, guys. The idea is that you want to put this bait in front of as many fish as possible and focus on those key zones, making a lot of deliberate, quick presentations while throwing a bait that's a little bit different from what the other anglers on your lake are fishing. If you do this, you are not only going to catch a lot of good numbers in the jig, but you're probably going to catch some really big fish as well. It's just a big fish bait, and it is one of my favorite ways to target bass in the spring. I've been catching a lot of fish on the jig in my recent videos, so if you want to see a full breakdown of how I actually go about fishing on the lake, showing you the spots, the locations, the strategy, all that stuff, check out some of the videos down that I linked in the description. They are videos throwing these exact baits, showing you exactly what I'm doing on the water. And hopefully you enjoy these 3 rules videos. They give you more of a summarized view of my key strategies with each bait that I'm having success with. So if you enjoy this type of content, leave a comment down below. And other than that, thanks for checking out this video. See you on the next one.